All right, my friends, I wish you a happy Easter. I hope you had a good time with family and friends at home, a chance to kind of rest and be down for a few days before getting back into the home stretch. This week we only have one online class, so as you saw in the email that I sent, there is not much reading to do this week. It's a little bit lighter because, again, it's only one class worth of material. You will still have the weekly online quiz and discussion board to complete by Sunday evening. What I wanted to do is a couple of things in this week's kind of PowerPoint. Some of it's looking back and some of it is looking forward. So I wanted to give you a little bit of feedback on the group projects, which are all graded at this point. Overall, they were very well done. I was very impressed with what you all did, particularly in light of the context of you were not together on campus and able to physically sit and collaborate and work together, and that most of the work, I'm sure, that you did was done remotely and trying to work together and kind of complete a rigorous academic project that did involve, some research and collaboration. A couple of areas of growth as you move forward in terms of your own kind of doing these group tasks, group projects. Yes, some research was expected. There were a number of groups that, other than Catherine of Siena and notes from class, that did not include any kind of outside sources. So you did lose some points for that. Um, there were also a couple groups that didn't send me a works cited slide indicating where your sources came from, and you lost points for that. So if you saw the grades online and you weren't necessarily happy with your grade, that may be part of the reason why you might have been missing either the outside research or you did not have a works cited page. Also, yes, you were to cite everything in the PowerPoint. Again, not that you couldn't have verbally said where things came from if you were presenting in class, but I had to go off of what was produced and visible on the screen, much like if I was actually reading a paper that you wrote. The grades for the projects are in the online gradebook. They've been in since last week. If your group has a specific question, if you want to know why you lost whatever points you did, one person from the group send me an email, include everybody's names on the email, and I can reply back to all and let you know where your points were lost. So as we move on, we take an opportunity to kind of look back a little bit at the events of last week in terms of the readings in our class, as well as the readings of where we are in the church year. And so the primary reading that you did for me last week was Mark chapters 11 to 15. I'm not going to recap all of the events that went in those chapters because I know you all read it. I just wanted to hit a couple of the highlights. Some of these were were focused in terms of questions in last week's quiz, and I know several students emailed me after the quiz last week and indicated that they felt like they didn't do as well on the quiz because they didn't have the PowerPoint video to kind of help them get ready for that. So one of the questions on the quiz had to do with bracketing and framing, and the example of bracketing and framing from Mark's Passion right at the very beginning was the fig tree story where Jesus comes into Jerusalem after his Palm Sunday, what we call Palm Sunday entry. He kind of curses the fig tree, may never, no one ever eat fruit of you again. The very next scene, we see Jesus cleansing the temple and overturning the money changer's table. And then the very next scene, we go back to the fig tree, and the disciples are like, "Hey, look, Jesus, the fig tree is withered." And again, the point of this is, as Mark's style goes, is to bracket together a chunk of material that all is about the same theme. It's a common theme. And the fig tree here and the temple, the two things that are linked together, is the sense of what kind of fruit is being produced. Jesus is upset with the fig tree because it's not producing fruit. Jesus is upset at the temple because the temple system had grown corrupt and it wasn't producing the proper kind of fruit within the lives, within the hearts of the Jews of Jesus's day. We see a series of questions that get posed to Jesus where those in power are trying to trap him or entrap him, we could say. One of the great stories is the story in Mark 12 where the group of Sadducees come up and ask Jesus a hypothetical situation about a woman who's married to like six different brothers. And the question is asked, whose husband or whose wife will she be in the afterlife? And the key here is that it's Sadducees who are asking the question. The Sadducees did not believe in the resurrection, so it's a mocking question. And so we have a whole series of these kinds of mocking stories, these mocking events where Jesus is trying to be entrapped by those Jewish authorities who were out to get him. We move forward to the Last Supper scene with the institution of the Eucharist. Again, a very key scene here. This is my body, this is my blood, do this in memory of me. And this is consistent in all three of the synoptic gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Um, One of the things too that's important here is what Jesus is celebrating with his apostles is a Passover Seder meal. And if you read carefully in N.T. Wright several chapters ago, you know that one of Wright's big points is that Jesus is ushering in a new Exodus event. So the timing here is very, very significant. Of course, the Passover, you'll recall from the Exodus event, was the meal the Jews celebrated the night before they got their freedom from slavery. Eventually, after Jesus gets arrested, he's brought before the council, which is the Sanhedrin. This is the Jewish governing council of his time period. They have a trial, or kind of a farce of a trial, if you read it carefully. You know that they bring people to testify in court. The testimony doesn't agree. Jesus doesn't say a whole lot. I've often asked students in an in-class setting, well, why not? Why doesn't Jesus defend himself if he's being wrongly accused? The key in the passage is the testimony of the people they bring against Jesus doesn't agree. So if there's no collaboration in the evidence, if you know anything about law, you don't say anything, right? You're just going to end up saying something they're going to twist and use to incriminate himself. That's why Jesus doesn't respond. The testimony doesn't agree. He doesn't need to say anything. Finally, the high priest gets frustrated and he asks Jesus, "Are you the Messiah? Are you the Son of the Blessed One?" And Jesus responds kind of prophetically with the phrase, "I am." And you might be tempted to say, well, there's the end of the messianic secret. You know, it's the cat's out of the bag, so to speak. Jesus is revealing he is the Messiah. But there's a deeper meaning here. If you go back again to the Exodus event, Moses at the burning bush, when he asks God, "What is your name?" God says, "I am." So when Jesus is asked, "Are you the Messiah?" he's not just giving an affirmation, "Yes, I am," but he's actually saying the name of God. He's saying, "Yahweh, I am." And the high priest gets upset and tears off his own robes and says, "Look, we have no further witnesses of this. What do you guys think?" And the council says, "Well, he deserves to die because the charge is blasphemy. He has blasphemed by using the very name of God." However, because the Jews are an occupied nation, they have to take Jesus before Pontius Pilate, who is the Roman governor. He's kind of the Roman rep who's in charge of that region of the empire. They need Pilate to sign off on the death warrant. Now, Pilate, as a Roman figure, is not going to be concerned about a religious charge. So they have to come up with some sort of another charge that might get Pilate's attention. And they try to get Pilate to see that Jesus is a revolutionary. He's an insurrectionist. He's a rebel rouser. Now, again, Pilate might say, well, he's not really a threat. In fact, if you read the story carefully, Pilate comes across as somewhat sympathetic. If anything, he's a dupe. He gives in to peer pressure. Um, but Pilate doesn't want to have a revolt on his hands because that would reflect badly on him, and ultimately he would probably lose his job and whatever power and money he gets from being a governor. And so he gives in to the Jewish leaders' demands and agrees to Jesus's execution. We have the powerful crucifixion scene, and again, if we were together in a class, I'd talk a lot more about the physiology of crucifixion. Just a couple of brief words here. The Romans perfected the technology, and I use that word intentionally, of crucifixion. They would have as many as several hundred crucifixions in a day, publicly, liking the spectacle. They didn't want a criminal to die en route to the place of crucifixion from the place of trial because they wouldn't have their spectacle. They had trained executioners who traveled around the empire, going city to city, conducting these executions. So they understood, the physiological, implications of how to conduct a crucifixion. This was not a one-time event. This was something that happened a lot. In fact, there are some Roman records that indicate that possibilities of several hundred crucifixions at one time in any major city might have been ongoing. And so this was a part and parcel of life at that time period, a terribly painful way to die, a type of death that's excruciating, and is generally not quick. The people would be up on the cross for several days before they would eventually die. We see the dying words or hear the dying words of Jesus in Mark's gospel as, my God, why have you abandoned or forsaken me?" And I think this is so appropriate for Mark. Remember, Mark is trying to show us a Jesus who's very much a a relatable human being, a human who experiences the whole gamut of emotions. And if you think about what he's endured the last few hours of his life, if not the last few days, he's been betrayed, he's been denied, he's been ridiculed, he's been mocked, he's been publicly flogged and scourged, he's been beaten. And here he is at near his point of death, crying out to God, "Where are you? Where are you, God? Why have you abandoned or forsaken me?" It's very interesting if you have time to look in the synoptic gospels of Matthew and Luke. Jesus' dying words are slightly different because each gospel is recording a profound message from Jesus to the particular audience that's receiving that gospel, something that would have been relevant to that audience. That's the redaction criticism we talked about several weeks ago. I did not include that in the quiz last week or as in your discussion board, but it's something if you want to dig into this a little bit more, it's pretty interesting to see that despite the fact we have great continuity of the events leading up to Jesus' death, there is great diversity in the dying words that are recorded in the Gospels. It's at this moment, kind of anticlimactically in many ways, it's a Roman centurion, a Roman Gentile guard who says, "Truly, this was the Son of God." And this is the moment, I said to you several weeks ago, watch for the moment where the messianic secret is revealed. And I also had indicated to you that in Mark's gospel, it's the Gentiles who are the heroes. It's at the crucifixion, connecting the dots now, a Roman Gentile who breaks, reveals the messianic secret. Again, all of Mark's styles kind of coming together in this very important and profound scene. Next, what I'd like to do is offer a couple of words about N.T. Wright, chapter 13, which was also part of last week's readings, which was the question from Wright's end of why did the Messiah have to die? And one of the things, again, to kind of open this up, Wright mentions Jesus didn't fit the labels of his day. You had a quiz question that asked you about those labels, the fact that Jesus was in some ways a Messiah, but not the kind of Messiah that people expected. A rabbi, he was someone who had a different message, and a different teaching style than people of Jesus' day were used to. He was a priest in many ways, Wright says, but he didn't serve in the temple the way other priests did, and he often did things publicly to upstage the priests. He was a prophet, but yet he was more than a prophet, and he referred to himself as such in various ways in the New Testament. So people have trouble understanding Jesus, and so if he doesn't fit their kind of stereotypes, that's going to make him a target. Wright goes on to also talk about that at the very beginning of the gospel, Jesus overcoming Satan's temptations in the wilderness and receiving his own baptism was the very beginning of God's victory over sin and death, which leads us to, well, there has to be an ending. Just as there's a moment where one, say, enters a war, there's a point where that war comes to an end. And so that's kind of the other piece. The Messiah has to die because it's the ending of this cosmic battle that's raging between God and the forces of sin and the devil in the world. Of course, Wright's favorite theme that we see so much in the latter half of the book is this idea of Jesus beginning a new exodus. Again, it's time for God to do something dramatic to help his people out, like he did in the past thousands of years ago with the Jews enslaved in Egypt. And Wright, of course, has already unpacked for us 7 different themes or ways that we can apply this theme for the present day. Finally, Wright mentioned this whole discussion of the act of love. Is crucifixion an act of love? And that was the focus of the discussion board that I had you write on. And most people did very, very well with it. The obvious answer is yes, it is, but it's more so than that. Okay. In fact, Wright even goes so far as to say we can belittle the crucifixion if we limit it to simply seeing it as an act of love. So those that didn't get 100% on last week's discussion board, it was probably because you said yes, it simply is just an act of love. Wright clearly says it's more than that, and you can go see page 184 for a little more detail on that. Wright goes on to say it's more than, as I said, love. It's also penal. It's Jesus accepting the punishment of a fallen humanity, that it's exemplary, that Jesus is this representational figure who is taking on the burdens of his people, of his nation. He becomes a kind of cosmic scapegoat. Theologically, today we use the words redemption and justification to describe his death on the cross. Redemption is about cashing in a kind of a coupon, you might say today, but in Jesus' day it had to do with debt slavery. where people could be enslaved to pay off a debt. You would give up your freedom to pay off debt that you owe that you were unable to financially pay. And so if somebody came along out of their generosity and paid off your debt, thereby earning you freedom, you would be considered, quote unquote, redeemed. That's what happens for us, right? If we believe that we are under the effects of sin and I can't undo those effects, I can't pay off the debts of my own sin, but yet Jesus' death redeems me. He pays off my debt, buying me freedom. And justification. Justified is to be right, to be in an appropriate relationship again. If you think about an opportunity or time in your life where maybe you offended a parent, you violated their trust, and it took a while to get it back again. Things were kind of awkward. But eventually, things get better. You get justified. You get put back into a right place in that relationship. And so these are other words or other ways, other levels that we can understand the kind of profound beauty of the crucifixion. I often ask students in class if we're together, why do we call the day Jesus dies Good Friday? It certainly doesn't seem to be good. But if we understand the crucifixion is more than just an act of love, it is that, but it's more. If we understand the redemption, the justification, the representational, the exemplary nature of it, and so on, we can see that there is quite a bit of good that comes from his death on the cross. You can't have Easter Sunday without Good Friday. Finally, Wright says Jesus' death was and is the ultimate way that God's kingdom was to become a reality. This is the concluding of the war and the battle against sin and the devil. That line we hear over and over again in the Our Father when we pray it every day, or however often we pray it, is, Thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Jesus' death is the way God's kingdom becomes a reality according to Wright, here and now. And so looking ahead now to what you're going to be reading this week, and again, the readings are quite a bit lighter because you're only doing the readings for basically one class, and I even lightened that a little bit from what I thought we should read for the week. So looking at Easter and beyond. In the Gospel of Mark, you're going to read just chapter 16. Two things that I would kind of caution you to look for as you do the reading is the style. The last 5 chapters of Mark, very polished, very much narrative written. Now we're getting back to, I guess, the style we saw at the beginning of the Gospel. The fact that Mark has 2 endings, an original ending which ended with verse, I think it's 8 of chapter 16 and stopped. And then at some point, either Mark or one of his followers added some additional stories. So notice that Mark's gospel has 2 endings. And one of the things I'd ask you to think about is suppose that the original ending was all there was, the first 8 verses. What do you think about the ending then? You're going to read Matthew 28. A couple things that I would report here or have you kind of note is this whole sense of drama that Matthew has. You know, Jesus dies on the cross on Good Friday in Matthew's gospel. There's an earthquake at the moment of his death, and the temple of the curtain is torn in two in the temple in Jerusalem. And same thing here, the moment of his resurrection on Easter Sunday morning, there's drama with the earthquakes. You know, we have the inclusion of the guards who were underplayed, if you will, in Mark's gospel, but are more featured here in Matthew's resurrection account. And then in Luke's gospel, pay attention to the story of the disciples on the road to Emmaus. It's a story that only Luke contains, but it's one of the most beautiful, I think, and powerful stories about Jesus, the resurrected Jesus, that we find in the New Testament. And finally, you're going to be reading N.T. Wright chapter 14. And again, a couple things here. He calls it the chapter Under New Management, Easter and Beyond. And what I'd like you to focus on really are 3 questions. What does Wright say about Easter and the resurrected Jesus? You know, this whole question of is Jesus simply a body with new life? Is Jesus a ghost? You know, what actually is the resurrected Jesus? Second, what does Wright say about the ascension of Jesus? Why is it important? What are some of the lessons we're supposed to take away from it? Is the ascension for Wright more important than the resurrection? And lastly, What does Wright say about Jesus' possible return? We've talked about that concept of parousia quite a bit when we were together as a class. Christ has died, Christ is risen, Christ will come again. Christ has died, Christ is risen, he's going to ascend into heaven, and we wait his return. What does life look like while we're waiting? Is it a time of joy? Somewhat. Is it a time of hope? Surely. But what else? I think Wright's answers might surprise you.